Our next step is a little bit of preliminary configuration to do. Some of this is hot fixes and patches, and some of it is security related and network port opening and firewalls. Just things that are going to need to be done before we can really configure and start using SharePoint and have the different servers communicating with each other the way they're supposed to. First, some operating system hotfixes that need to be applied to your operating system before you install SharePoint. So these apply to the machines where the SharePoint software will be installed. So on Windows 2012, there's one hotfix to apply. On Windows 2008 R2, there are 3. Again, this is from the TechNet documentation, so make sure that you read through that documentation because these requirements possibly could change or be added to over time. Next, a little bit of preliminary setup on each of the servers that are running the SharePoint software. So these don't apply to the SQL servers, so the SPDB 1, 2, and 3 that are in this environment, we don't need to do this, but this is for all those SharePoint servers, so all the other ones. So if possible, run Windows Update until no further patches are available. In your environment, you may not actually run every patch that's available on every Patch Tuesday, so follow your local procedures, but I will generally try to get the machines as updated as possible before moving forward. Second, make sure the hotfixes on the previous slide are actually installed on those machines. Those are required. The SharePoint will probably install without them, but you may have malfunctions down the road that could have been avoided had you gone ahead and got all these prerequisites done. Next, mount the ISO for the SharePoint software onto the machine so you can run your setups. And then SharePoint is installed in kind of a two-phase process. The first is to install or lay the bits down on the machines, and the second is to actually do the configuration. So these two steps are installing prerequisite and running SharePoint installation with the full option. These are the laying down the bits part, and then later on we'll do the configuration. I'm not actually going to walk through these two steps. Look at the notes for this lesson and you'll find some links to other lessons from SharePoint 2010 that actually did this. The process is exactly the same, so rather than going through all that over again, I'll just refer you to that. So look for those links down below this video. And on the prerequisite installers, if you don't have internet connectivity to the SharePoint servers, you will have a lot of extra work to do. It is documented what the prerequisite installer actually does. You can download all of that software manually and run it by hand on the servers to get the prereqs on there. However, if you can get internet connectivity for those servers, your life is going to be tremendously easier. And just as a side note, if you are using virtual machines, do all this on one virtual machine, sysprep it, and then copy it 7 times, and you'll have 7 servers or however many you need for SharePoint, and then join them all to the domain. In fact, the environment that I'm configuring, that's exactly what I did. It's like a shortcut step. The next thing we need to do is set this setting on the database server where the SharePoint content will be located. This is the max degrees of parallelism is set to 1. This has been a recommendation from Microsoft for SharePoint for a long time. With 2013, it is a requirement. If you try to install SharePoint and use a database that doesn't have this setting set on it, it actually won't install. You'll get an error message. So where you find that is going on to your database server. So run Management Studio, connect to the instance you'll be using for your SharePoint content. In my case, that's the SPDB1, and then I have a named instance called SharePoint. When I connect to that and right-click on the instance, Properties, and you notice it's the default is 0, which means let the server decide. I'm going to change that to 1 and click OK. The next step is to set up security for the SharePoint Farm service account. So this is the master controlling service account that SharePoint uses to kind of run itself. And it needs a lot of permissions because, for example, when you say I'm going to run some service over on one of the servers in the farm, it's the Service SP Farm or the Farm service account that does that deployment and modifies things in the operating system. So it needs a lot of permission. So the things we need to do are make it a local administrator on all of the SharePoint servers. Now that doesn't include the external server that hosts the database. It doesn't include some server that's running SMTP, but all of the other servers in the farm, it needs to be a local admin on. And that's easy to do if we just look at one of these SharePoint servers. And in computer management, look at the local administrator group. We'll see that the farm account is already there. Be mindful that your group policy in your domain may override things like this. So if you make changes like this on your individual servers and 15 minutes later they've been wiped out, then it's time to talk to the Active Directory team about group policy. The other change we need to make is granting a couple roles for that farm account on the database server. So when SharePoint creates content databases and so on, it needs the farm account is the account that's going to do that, so it needs permissions to carry out those instructions. So these are the things we need: the security admin and the DB creator role. Again, if you don't do these steps, then your installation of SharePoint will fail. So to do that, again, we'll go to the instance where our SharePoint content is going to be. Look at security, and if I look in here, I see the farm account isn't there yet. So I just want to go to security logins, add a new login, add the farm account as a Windows credential, and then I'll bring that back up. So its server roles are going to be security admin and DB creator. So go ahead and click OK. Finally, we need to make some adjustments to the Windows firewall ports. Now, it's possible that you've shut the Windows firewall off completely, in which case you can skip this step. However, if you are being secure in your environment and Windows Firewall is running, you just need to make sure that the ports are open so that when your SharePoint servers want to talk to the SQL server, they can actually do it. So for SQL Server, a couple of ports we need. One is the port for the SQL instance. Now, if you have a named instance, you have to be careful about which port is that instance running on. And ideally, just set the port to the instance so that you know what it is and you know it can't possibly change. In my case, I set the port to 1433. And I just need to set Windows Firewall so that it will allow incoming connections to port 1433. Next, if you're using named instances, you need to open up ports for SQL Browser. So SQL Browser has fixed ports. You can't change these, which is great because we always know what they are. And these are fixed to UDP port 1434, TCP 2382. So just add these to Windows Firewall inbound rules and you'll be all set. And then finally, if you're running analysis services, which I will be in this environment on SPDB2, then you need to open up a TCP port for that as well. Now again, the TCP port can be changed and it can be dynamic. So if you're running Windows Firewall, it's usually a best practice to assign a specific TCP port so that your documentation reflects exactly what's going on in your server. If you're not sure what port's being used in your environment, you can use at the Windows command prompt netstat A to inspect what ports are actually being listened on, and by sometimes process of elimination figure out what port these services are actually using. And you can use telnet to test to see whether you can actually make a connection through the network to these ports. So telnet will either tell you the connection's refused, in which case it's probably being blocked by the Windows Firewall, or you may get connection to a big black screen or something like that, and that will show you. And I'll look at some of these troubleshooting steps in one of the very last lessons, and we'll take a look at that. So if you're wondering about that right now, maybe kind of skip ahead and go find that later lesson and take a look at it. So just a quick example of what we might need to do with Windows Firewall is run the Windows Firewall itself, and my rules are already in here, but I'll show you what they look like. I created a single rule to catch the TCP ports for both my SQL instance and the SQL browser. So you can see here I'm allowing inbounds on 1433 and 2382. And then browser has a UDP rule that's needed as well. So if I look at my 1434 UDP inbound rule, that's allowing the browser. So on this server, which is the server hosting the SharePoint content, I have SQL browser and relational SQL instances that are accepting connections. Now I will say there is a different way to do this that potentially can be easier to configure, and that is to allow by program. So you can actually specify the executable of SQL Server and of SQL Browser, and Windows Firewall will just allow any connection that those executables happen to be listening on. And that might make your configuration easier. You might like that method better. I think either method is fine. And with that, we have our preliminaries out of the way, and we can start configuring and deploying SharePoint in our environment.